It's Friday and you're watching FreightWaves Now. I'm your host Anthony Smith, and coming up, Luke Falasca is going to give us a broker update. We also have Andrew Cox back with us with the DHL Supply Chain Pricing Power Index update. But first, we're going to go to Zach Strickland with the carrier update brought to you by PowerFleet. Stay tuned.
Welcome to your carrier update on this Friday. Hopefully everybody had a great week. Watching the volumes continue to press sideways after a weird little hiccupy week. This is, we're still, hovering around that 8,600 level, 8,690 right now in the outbound tender volume index. Volumes do continue to show us some signs of hope, but again, next week will be the big week to tell whether or not we have significantly moved out of this trough or not. Again, considering the time that we're living in, you never know if we're going to stair step this one up, down, etc. So give it time. Again, last week was Easter, so we're still kind of recovering from that right now. Looking at the green line, outbound tender rejection rates still going down, record levels. 2.87% tender rejection rate. So carriers are gobbling up all the freight that they can, probably seeing a lot of deadhead percentage increases out there, just trying to get to where the freight is. This is still a significantly soft market, regardless of the fact that we have flattened out for the time being, and even shown a slight uptick day over day, a 0.5 percentage point jump yesterday. We are still well below where we would normally expect to be this time of year, roughly 7 to 10%, depending on how you account for the Easter holiday in there, below year-over-year levels. This is not going to be easy time period for carriers to continue to keep their utilization rates higher. So we really need to know where those markets are jumping up. Looking at the OTVIW, good news here. 2.98% week over week increase, 2 straight days of a weekly increase on the OTVI. So there is some sign that we have somewhat cratered for the time being, starting to move out a little bit, but that number may come back a little bit next week due to the fact that we were recovering from that Easter trough, which does have about a 4 to 5% impact on overall volumes in general. So continuing to clear that, moving forward, hope for the best. Looking at any outbound volatility signals, anything out there that's telling us that we are going to see significant increases in volumes in some of these markets, maybe some significant increases in tender rejection rates. Who knows at this point? Just because the overall volumes and overall tender rejection rates have collapsed doesn't mean that you're not going to see some isolated pockets change across the country. That's what this map is for right here. It's going to show you any statistically significant movement in volatility, and either the one that I have pulled up here is volume, but you could also do this for rejection rates, etc. Most of those rejection rates, however, are very soft right now, going downward. So I pulled up the volume here just to show where some of these contracted freight volumes are moving right now with any statistical relevance. Now, a lot of these markets are relatively small, but Seattle, for instance, not a small market, showing some increases. Portland showing some decent increases in volumes overall. But looking over here, I've got it sorted by the top markets in the United States. Moderate increase in Elizabeth, New Jersey, a port market, one of the largest in the United States. So that is a pretty big deal. Down here around Mexico, across the border, in Laredo, in McAllen, for instance, showing some decent increases there. Memphis showing a good outbound increase, and that is a pretty big market in itself. So if you are operating in these markets today, definitely be aware that these may have some potential extra freight volumes for you. Especially on the week over week level. So outbound tender market share level, just another way of looking at this. What are the markets that are moving the most significantly in terms of general market share, not an absolute value? Ontario, Atlanta, Salt Lake City, Portland, as we talked about. Detroit, one to keep an eye on as things start to open up. Detroit showing a little bit of headway on their outbound tender market share value. So again, they're not falling with everybody else. They're kind of keeping their rates propped up a little, their volumes propped up a little bit. Phoenix, Kansas City, not doing great. Stockton, California, also not doing great. Going to keep an eye on Fresno, California, moving forward, produce season just around the corner. Looking at Elizabeth, New Jersey, that market has really had a lot of volatility over the last year with increasing port volumes coming into the port of New York, New Jersey. Fell off dramatically there at the end of March, early April, and now is starting to pick back up. Some of those megalopolis volumes may help prop up some carriers up in the northeastern corridor. And that'll do it for today's Carrier Update.
The comprehensive logistics offerings from PowerFleet cover in-cab ELD, fleet management, trailer tracking, cargo monitoring, and tracking other assets such as chassis and intermodal containers. Power up your operations with PowerFleet.
Hi, good morning everybody, and happy Friday. We've made it, although the days tend to blend together right now. But anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at the charts. We saw our second uptick this week in freight volumes, okay? So if you notice here, now nothing to get too excited about. We're still heavily suppressed, roughly 12% lower than where we typically are, where we would like to be. But still a good sign, better than slipping down further. Now the green line on the other hand is your tender rejections that are continuing to slip. We broke the 3% mark. We are now down at 2.87, which is exceptionally low, the lowest we have seen year over year by any stretch of the measure. So that's going to continue to lower spot market rates. Now let's go ahead and look at this map. This is our 7-day volume change map. We've been looking at this all week long to see how volume levels change. Just because volume levels are remaining steady right now across the nation does not mean that is the case everywhere. For example, these red areas are where volume levels are decreasing. And then the blue areas are where volume levels are increasing, and the white are relatively unchanged, maybe a slight uptick or a slight downtick. You can see here, right around the Seattle region is actually seeing some good increasing right now, about 12 to 15% increase in volume levels over the last 7 days. Same here, Tallahassee has really exploded. Again, not a big market there, but has seen a little bit of growth. Down there on the border of Texas, particularly around Laredo area, seeing some increases. And then kind of all along here, this Mississippi region going pretty much from Tallahassee all the way up to almost Chicago has seen a lot of increase in volume there. So some great opportunities to call. Obviously, now when you see these markets in blue, it doesn't mean that the volume levels are high. It just means that they are increasing. Same thing, the markets in red may not have low volumes, just overall they are decreasing. So let's understand that. Now, this next map that we're going to look at, this is what we call our head haul index. So head haul measures capacity. It takes the difference in volume going into a market and a volume going out of a market to understand that freight balance. So the markets here, this is the 7-day change. The markets in blue are where that head haul scale is increasing, meaning capacity is getting tighter. There is more volume going out of those markets than what's coming in. And then the red and white markets are the opposite. That is where capacity is loosening. Okay, so now you'll notice here that pretty much most of California is blue right now. It means it's continuing to tighten. There's going to be less and less capacity to move the freight. Same thing here, look at blue here in Florida. Now that doesn't mean that Florida has tight capacity. It doesn't mean that Florida is a head haul market. What it means is over the last 7 days, Florida is getting tighter. This is a good sign. Just because volume levels are going down does not mean that capacity is going to just get really loose everywhere. While it is loose overall, there are plenty of areas that are continuing to tighten. Great way to also make calls in these markets and understand that shippers there will have more difficulty covering their freight today than they did last week. The market we're going to look at right now is Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis, Tennessee has quite a wild market, a pretty big market actually, particularly in the southeast for volume levels. The blue line is the truckload volume level. We saw a massive surge going up, very similar to what we saw in all the other markets around the COVID time, and then we fell off a cliff. Now we fell well below where volumes typically sit, about 15% where they typically sit, so in line with the national average, but we have bounced back up. You see this blue line, that big bounce right there over the last few days? That's a fantastic bump. Volume levels are pretty much right back where they typically are for Memphis. If you look, this chart is year to date. We're pretty much sitting right about where we typically are for Memphis volume levels. That's a really good sign. Great market to focus on. Tender rejections, on the other hand, that green line, those are continuing to decrease down about 50% lower than where they typically are when volume levels are at this. So it looks like spot market rates are continuing to go lower, so you will have to push your rates down in order to stay competitive. I'm Luke, and that'll do it for today's broker update.
Voices from every corner of the supply chain concerning all modes of transportation. From the world's largest logistics podcast network, this is what the Freight Tech Revolution sounds like. Freightcast presented by FreightWaves. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the DHL Supply Chain Pricing Power Index Update. I'm here with Andrew Cox. Andrew, what's the latest?
Anthony, we have a 10-point swing to the shippers this week. The index is now at 15, which is tied for the lowest that it's been in its history. And the shippers have all the power right now, but it's for all the wrong reasons, and I'll tell you why. So here's our outbound tender volume index. So as Zach and Luke both said, that volumes have been flat for about 10 days now. They've been horizontal for almost 2 weeks now, and it's not really constructive for either the shippers or the carriers in pricing power for volumes to be at Independence Day levels for 2 weeks. I mean, it's just not. Luckily, there are parts of the economy that are beginning to reopen. We've seen Georgia even opening up some service-based industries, salons and gyms today. Unfortunately for freight volumes, those are industries that don't really move a lot of freight, but there are two really constructive pieces of information I got for you that are going to put some upward pressure on volumes. The first one is the industrial manufacturing sector are now, they're laying out plans to how to reopen. It looks like 2 weeks is kind of the aiming point to how to open up with, changed conditions, modified conditions, especially the automotive sector. They seem to be wanting to get back online. And then I looked at some Bank of America consumer spending data from their credit and debit cards, and it really improved significantly at the end of last week. And I think it had a little bit to do with that stimulus bonus that a lot of people got on the 15th. But if we look at the consumer spending data on the 15th and 16th and 17th, it absolutely exploded. We actually brought consumer spending from down 40% year over year to down between 5 and 10% at the end of last week.
Right, and just as you mentioned, industrial manufacturing is going to be a sector that's going to be a little bit more impactful as we're looking at goods moving throughout the economy. We see different regional economies opening back up. As you mentioned, Georgia, some of these service-facing industries, that's going to be helpful for especially those that are being employed by those industries potentially. But as you mentioned, not moving a lot of freight. Automotive, just as you said, going to be an area that we're going to be watching closely. I think Ford might be leading the charge right now, looking to kind of come back online. But really, manufacturing is one of the areas that we thought were going to be kind of coming back online first and foremost. And interesting to see them kind of leading that charge even without any kind of prodding or poking with any kind of stimulus right now.
Yeah, our CEO Craig Fuller said on the coronavirus update the other day that he thinks that the industrial manufacturing sector will be the ones that kind of lead the charge and lead to bring these freight volumes back up. I'm really hoping that's the case. It seemed to be that kind of is the story that's building here. But right now, the reason that the pricing power is so low for the carriers is this outbound tender rejection index. So it's at 2.87. This is the lowest that it's been in its 3-year history. Carriers are just currently accepting anything and everything they can get on the contract freight markets because there really is no spot freight. If you look at our truck stop data, the spot volume index, it is near Christmas Day levels, so there's nothing to do in the spot market. So everybody is accepting anything they can in this contract market, which gives all the power to the shippers.
Right. And with all of that capacity, it really is going to make it difficult for a lot of these carriers. Many of them are small businesses. They're going to be struggling. Do you expect to see a lot of bankruptcies and foreclosures, things like that, as you saw at the latter half of 2019?
Even before the coronavirus, we expected for 2020 to be a kind of a rough year for carriers. We thought Q1 and Q2 were going to see a lot of bankruptcies because we saw, the operating ratios in our TPP data in Sonar was up, in the 99 to over 100 for most of 2019. It's been the same way for 2020, and we've seen, insurance rates continue to go up, costs are up. The only thing that's down is helping them is a little bit of diesel prices, but talk of all of those pre-problems, and now you have the problem where there's really no volume. This is going to be a really rough quarter for the carriers.
Right. Andrew, sounds like a lot of moving parts, insightful information as always. Where can people find more about you and your team?
So they can go to freightwaves.com/passport. We'll have a weekly article coming out today. We had the DHL supply chain pricing power come out yesterday. We've got a bunch of articles out right now. I know that the Passport team just did a mapping of Amazon's logistics platform, so that's on there as well.
Excellent. Andrew, thank you so much. We appreciate it. And thank you so much for tuning in. That's going to do for this update for the DHL Supply Chain Pricing Power Index. Be sure to tune in next week for all the latest. Thanks so much for tuning in. That's going to do for this Friday edition of FreightWaves Now. The content doesn't stop here. We're always streaming around the clock, so be sure to check out our FreightWaves TV app on all your favorite streaming platforms. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode.